We're starting on page 38 with federalism. And if you missed the last episode, I talked at length about federalism, but I think it's very important to remind listeners that Americans often get confused when we call the national government the federal government, because states are also part of the federal government. But every time the term federal government is used in this book, in the news, everywhere you read about it, everywhere you hear about it, it should be understood that this term, federal government, is referring to the centralized or national government that's seated in Washington, D.C., okay? So federalism, this idea of shared power between the states and the national government, is the glue holding the foundational stones of American constitutionalism together. Yet those in Washington, D.C. have made it quite evident they want to consolidate power in D.C., while simultaneously crippling the power of the states and state legislators. Our rulers in D.C. are indeed attempting to nationalize everything they believe they can get away with, not just election law. There has been a successful push to nationalize education, from the NCLB, No Child Left Behind, to the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. From the adoption of Common Core standards and a push for a nationwide curriculum, to the conflict between the 1619 Project and the 1776 Project, our national government wants to control the public school system. Even though the schools have traditionally not just been the jurisdiction of the states, but of local school boards in specific districts. Our rulers in D.C. want to take that away from local and state governments and really nationalize the entire thing. They do it through incentives and stuff like that. The 2022 Dobbs ruling put abortion back into the hands of the states. But lawmakers in Washington, D.C. immediately rebelled and quickly tried to garner support to nationalize Roe v. Wade. I think they're still actually trying to do that. But choice and freedom would be greater without doing so. The Dobbs decision left all abortion law in the hands of each state. Yes, some states immediately set about to effectively ban all abortion, but other states immediately set about to effectively decriminalize infanticide. Most states, however, have, at least thus far at the writing of the book, decided to maintain their status quo, unwilling to topple the apple cart. This provides, not just in theory, but in reality, greater choice for the American people. Not only will this produce abortion sanctuary states, but those who are able can vote with their feet and move to a state that more closely aligns with their values. Why would those in D.C. want to take these freedoms and this freedom of choice away from people? Why do they want to take such legislative powers away from the states? Same-sex marriage was another area where the Supreme Court's decision, Obergefell, 2015, helped nationalize policy traditionally left in the hands of the states and eliminated choice in the same way the Roe decision did. With fear of the current Supreme Court makeup, the current Congress is no longer willing to risk leaving such nationalized policy at the mercy of courts and has instead worked to pass the Respect for Marriage Act 2022 to ensure the nationalization of the policy. From gun laws to environmental laws to unfunded mandates, the centralized government has imposed more and more regulations and requirements on the states while seeking to take away constitutional protections of state power. Federalism indicates shared power. More often than not, the positions taken by those in D.C. appear to indicate they are tired of sharing. And then there is the administrative state. When the EPA versus West Virginia of 2022 decision highlighted an ongoing issue with nationalizing power and removing power from the states, our rulers in D.C. got visibly angry and pumped into the national narrative how dangerous such a move is and talked up the threat such decisions are to the people of the United States. In reality, there are just a lot of people in Congress and across the country that see the now right-leaning Supreme Court as a threat to the status quo they have come to enjoy. The EPA versus West Virginia of 22 ruling revealed to those paying attention that we are already being run by an administrative state, with agency regulations having the force of law even though the heads of these agencies and their permanent bureaucracies were never elected and the American people have no methods of checking their power. Not only have we seen the power and reach of the CDC over the past few years, but OSHA, the IRS, and the FDA have also been exposed as unelected power brokers to whom much power has been given, with no recourse in the hands of Americans to mitigate the infringements upon our liberties at the hands of these agencies. And while legislation belongs in the hands of the legislators, as long as they could avoid blame for such infringements, they were happy to allow that power to accumulate, knowing that it would ultimately benefit them, as they too were in power. I've already opined on the fourth branch of government and federalism in previous episodes, so I want to move on to intertwined responsibilities pretty quickly, but you have to understand that they were supposed to be at odds with each other. And that's what we'll talk about that within intertwined responsibilities. And hopefully that will make sense. You can apply it backwards to this section on bureaucracies. Intertwined responsibilities were a central component of the government's conscience, as each action by the government was supposed to not only require input from more than one branch of government, but the branches, partly because they were beholden to differing bases of power, were supposed to act as a check on the other branches. And the powers of each branch of government were supposed to balance the powers of the other two branches. These checks and balances sought to use the more selfish inclinations of those in power. The Senate would act in its own interests, not in the interests of the president, for example. Meanwhile, the House would act in its own best interests, not in the interests of the Senate. And Congress as a whole would act in its own best interests, not in the interests of the executive branch, which is what we don't see happening with that fourth branch of government, the bureaucracy. This separation or struggle between branches is why the president cannot introduce legislation or come into the Capitol unless invited by Congress. And again, the branches were supposed to be at odds with one another, but instead, we see the party system controlling the way business is run. Instead of the powers of one body checking the powers of another body, now it's one party pretending to obstruct the other party from achieving their goals. And if there is a Congress controlled by the same party as the White House, it appears that all the checks and balances seem to go out the window. The individuals in office are still acting selfishly, but not in the interest of their institution. Instead, it seems that they're acting selfishly in the interest of their political party. James Madison foresaw this. And he talked about the danger of factions, what we would actually call political parties today. And he thought it was very dangerous should they get control of our governing institutions. And yet here we are. And yes, it is exactly as Madison warned. The conscience no longer pulls our officials toward their better potentialities. I mean, it appears to me at least that more often than not, and maybe always because we just don't know everything that goes on in Congress, they tend to cave to their lower selves, their baser instincts, their own short-term gains. Remember, there was supposed to be something of an inverse relationship between powers between the different government entities, so that one branch or part of the government, even in their own quest for power, would find it in their own interest to limit the power of a competing government entity, or at least balance out that power by imposing their own. At least that is how it is supposed to work. When all branches or components of government are in the hands of a single party, however, the government starts acting more like a majoritarian democracy, with all parts in agreement and seeking to bolster power in the moment, not caring how this consolidation of power in the moment could lead to undesired consequences should they find themselves in the minority. Unfortunately, not only do we see presidents circumventing the legislative process through executive orders and executive agreements, but we see primary allegiance to political party instead of to the body politic. And when the House, Senate, and executive branch are all controlled by one party, none of those three governing bodies are checking the others. Whereas Congress should condemn executive orders because they have the power of law without going through the legislative process and thus reduce the power and legitimate authority of Congress. That condemnation does not happen when those in Congress agree with the executive order, but know it would never have made it through the legislative process. It is like allowing the imminent pole, one's baser instincts and passions, to guide our actions based on what we think we want to do in the moment, even though that action in the long run is bad for us. Instead of going through the pain of struggling with our higher self and giving up what we think we want in the short term for the long-term benefit, what we really want, or what the ethical conscience dictates. So maybe this really is an indictment of the American people as well. Those in power have figured out how to not only game the system, but I think they figured out the tendency of us soft, weak Americans to seek the easy answers in the moment. They've figured out that we will suffer evils so long as they are sufferable. If we perceive the solution to smaller problems as causing more suffering in the moment. And they would be right. We've been living in a way that indicates we cannot see that personal, individual, short-term suffering would actually be better for the entire country in the long term. We cannot comprehend how short-term suffering could prevent the complete destruction of the fabric of this nation.